When most people hear about a police shooting, it's usually because it's made national headlines. We hear names like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, or Tyre Nichols, and understandably, those stories leave a lasting impression and lots of talk. But I wanted to ask a different question. What does the complete data set actually say? Instead of looking at one incident, I analyzed every police killing recorded by the Mapping Police Violence database from 2013 through June 2026. If you haven't already seen this database, go ahead and look at it and you can see all the information I gathered for yourself. Rather than starting with an opinion, I started with the numbers. Some of what I found matched what I expected, but some of it didn't. My first chart tracks police killings by year. One thing immediately stood out. The number of police killings has stayed surprisingly consistent over the past decade. Every year there are roughly 1,000 deaths nationwide. While each death is significant, these incidents represent a very small fraction of the more than 330 million people living in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean every shooting was justified. It simply means that these events are statistically rare, even though they receive an enormous public attention because of their seriousness, and maybe even because of their rarity. The next chart breaks deaths down by state. California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Georgia have the largest circles, so that means they recorded the highest total numbers. At first glance, that may seem alarming, but population matters when it comes to these things. California and Texas are also the two most populous states in the country. Larger populations generally mean more police interactions, more arrests, and unfortunately, more deadly encounters. Now, this chart tells us where incidents occur most often, but by itself, it doesn't tell us whether policing is more or less dangerous in those states. For that, we need to compare deaths per capita or per police encounter. Next, I looked at race. Over the entire data set, white individuals account for the largest number of police killings, followed by black individuals and then Hispanic individuals. But it's important to remember that raw numbers don't tell the whole story. When I compare these totals to each group's percentage of the US population, a different pattern emerged. White Americans make up roughly 59% of the population, but account for only 47% of deaths in this data set. Black Americans make up about 13.7% of the population, but account for roughly 26% of police killings. Hispanic Americans also appear somewhat overrepresented compared to their share of the population. It's important to recognize what this comparison can and cannot show us. It shows us disproportionality relative to population, but it does not by itself explain why that disproportionality exists. Factors like crime rates, policing practices, neighborhood demographics, socioeconomic conditions, and police deployment could all contribute. Right here, my data can't necessarily determine a cause. It only starts to show an emerging pattern. My next chart examines whether people were fleeing when they were killed. Nearly 60% of those killed were reporting as not fleeing. About 14% were fleeing on foot. Another 14% were fleeing on a vehicle like a car or a motorcycle. The remaining cases either involved another situation or didn't have enough information to classify. Now, this is important about the data set. In almost every category, there are certain cases that are unreported, unrepresented in some way where we don't have the full data. So everything that we've examined, we have to understand that there's going to be a little bit of noise in that data. Now, this chart surprised me because many people imagine police shootings happening when there's a high-speed chase going on, like in the movies. But according to this data set, most deadly encounters occurred when the individual was reportedly not attempting to flee. Again, this doesn't tell us whether force was justified. It simply describes what was happening immediately before the encounter. This next chart combines two important factors, whether someone was armed and how threatening they were reported to be. You should pause the video here and really take a look at this data because I think a story is starting to appear. The largest category, over 6,000 cases, involved someone who was armed and reportedly used a weapon. Another large category involved someone who displayed or brandished a weapon. Then we begin seeing much smaller groups involving people who were unarmed or weapon status couldn't be determined. Now, for my final chart, I wanted to start to tell a story. I created a very conservative filter to identify incidents that might deserve additional scrutiny because I wanted to see, out of all of this, what can we count as potentially unjustifiable? It makes sense that police would need to shoot somebody that's actively shooting other people, or if their lives are directly in danger. But what percentage of these can we begin to look at with some judgment? And so, to be included, the case had to meet several conditions. On the mapping police killings database, the case had to meet several conditions. The person was reported as unarmed, or their armament was undetermined or unknown. Their threat level was reported as none, unknown, or missing. They could not be fleeing. They were not fleeing in a vehicle, since I found that nearly all vehicle-related deaths involved collisions or accidents rather than intentional shootings. Most of the time, it was police accidents, and the police ended up being prosecuted. Even after applying all those filters, it's important to remember something. Missing information does not mean officers acted improperly. Some reports simply lack enough evidence to determine exactly what happened. These filtered cases are described as potentially questionable or allegedly questionable, not automatically unjustified. In fact, going through some of the reported cases after these filters still showed me examples of misreports where people were actually using weapons against the police. So, what did I learn from everything? I found that police killings are statistically rare compared with the overall US population, but they remain significant as a public concern because every incident does involve a loss of human life, and it's important that people know what the police are doing in their area. Second, most recorded cases involve individuals reported to be armed, and only a relatively small subset meets the conservative screening criteria I created for possible further review. Finally, when adjusted against population, Black Americans, and to a lesser extent Hispanic Americans, appear overrepresented among those killed by police. That being said, again, it's a very, very small amount. I mean, you can see here on the graph, over 13 years, the small amount of people who've been killed through the unjustifiable, potentially, circumstances. We have 413 white people, 305 black people, 205 Hispanic people. Next is only 20 Asian people, and the categories just get smaller after that. My analysis can't explain why, but it does show that the disparity does exist and maybe deserves continued research and can be handled on the scale that it does exist. Rather than assuming every police shooting is either completely justified or completely unjustified, I think the data encourages a more balanced approach. It's complicated. Law enforcement are people. I mean, most cases by far appear to involve situations where officers believe they faced an armed threat. At the same time, every potentially questionable case should receive careful, transparent investigation. Better reporting, more complete data, and continued accountability can help build public trust while also protecting officers who did act appropriately. Ultimately, good policy starts with good evidence. That's why I wanted to begin with the data instead of the headlines. And maybe it can be comforting in some way. You are extremely statistically unlikely to be killed by a police officer. But police officers are a lot more likely to clear the streets of people who are dangerous and could hurt us. And I think that's important to remember.